I'm Michael Johnston. I am at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York, actually just retired from there, and am in a few months going to move from New York State to Texas. Well, I have a very high regard for ERCAS and for the Heritage School, for Alina and her project. You really do have a tremendously prominent group of scholars and practitioners gathered here. Plus, I think any excuse to come to Berlin is a good excuse. So I was delighted to be invited and very happy to be here. Well, certainly I've known Alina and her work since, I would say about 2004 or 5 at the latest, known it in print. And then we first met at a conference, I think 4 or 5 years ago. We've stayed in touch since then, and through a variety of mutual interests and mutual connections, it seems like we've been in contact quite a bit for about the last 3 years. I've been part of an international advisory board for the Anticorp project for the last few years. There are 5 of us, I think, and that first began at a meeting in Florence in 2013, and then I've stayed in touch that way. And I've had some connections with other projects in the Heritage School too, so it's easy to get involved, and the more involved I become, the more impressed I am with the quality of work that's done. I think you have a tremendous international reach. I think being based in Germany rather than in the United States, you have a degree of political and ideological freedom to take on different perspectives. There is a fine tradition of internationalism that I think the school has established already, and those are real plus factors. The anti-corruption movement will do best when people from around the world are talking to each other, and when not that you have people from the US and Canada and the UK talking to the rest of the world. So this is a real opportunity for me to listen as well. I think in some respects, the real fight is just beginning. The new generation can look at the first generation's efforts and see a few successes and perhaps a lot of disappointments as well. Alina was one of the first to really frankly point out the indifferent record of what we've done in the first generation. The new generation is looking at unusual measures of corruption, of good governance, looking at new cases in new sorts of ways, and that's all to the good. Plus, of course, that generation brings tremendous energy. I think that in terms of measuring corruption, there's a tremendous difference in terms of levels of development, the kinds of countries we're talking about, and so forth. In more advanced countries, a lot of data are available, making those data accessible as a matter of course. We can gather evidence on governmental processes and outcomes. That's relatively easy. But going into the developing world, we need grassroots data, we need people's experiences, the ways in which they cope with corruption on a day-to-day basis. That's a whole other realm of measurement and assessment that we're only beginning to scratch the surface with. My own thought is that if we look at how well and how rapidly government performs its functions, how openly it does so, and with the results, then we begin to have both better data and a better sense of why we care about corruption to begin with. Ultimately, corruption is a question of whether people can govern themselves in a just and fair manner. There are very few success stories, but I think my favorite recommendation is to stick with it for the long run, to fight corruption indirectly, to enable people to defend their own interests, their families, their home, their land, politically rather than by violence, we hope, and in the process insist upon a style of government that is more fair, more inclusive, and less corrupt. That's the work of generations. That takes a long time. It's not something we can do in 2 years. It's not something that will show up on a corruption index, but it will affect people's lives and affect them for the better. In terms of measuring corruption, I would look at some fairly basic things. Let's imagine that there are 2 cities, and in one city, getting a license takes 4 days, and there are 5 bureaucratic steps. In the other city, getting a license takes 3 weeks and there are 27 bureaucratic steps. Where is there likely to be more corruption? Well, it's in the latter city, of course. There are more bureaucratic roadblocks or toll gates. The long time that the process takes increases the incentive to pay up and so forth. We can measure those things, and in fact they vary to a surprising extent, even in countries like China. And we can get a sense, not that efficient government is necessarily more honest, but rather that certain kinds of inefficiencies are where corruption hides. And they're in little niches and little connections and little bureaucratic problems, not at the national level. Those are the kinds of things we need to measure.